And we continue our Newsmaker show. Our Newsmaker Hour is what it's become now. Welcoming now to our microphones, longtime Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's nice to be here on a rainy day.
Yes, it is. And meteorologist Rob Carolyn has some possibilities for snow in the forecast as well here on April 21st. Chance of snow. Dr. Ostrower, Assemblyman Palmisano, in the last segment, spoke of how he was so sad to hear about the death of Bill Haney.
Yeah, well, Bill Haney was he was a very close friend of mine. He came from Belfast. Bill was one of these people who knew a huge amount about the history of this area, especially about Allegheny County. He spoke frequently at places like the Howe Library and Wellsville and so forth about county history. I'm very, very saddened to hear that. I didn't know that until just a few minutes ago. And we're going to miss him. He had been the chairman of the Republican Party in Allegheny County for some time. He was also very, very close to Amo Houghton, who died just about 6 or 7 weeks ago. So, we've lost some good people recently. John Hasper, certainly Amo, who was an outstanding congressman, one of the few who really, how shall I put it, who resisted the partisan warfare that's become so very, very common today. And now Bill, who is likewise, I think, very, very much a moderate when it came to recognizing the loyalty of people who might disagree with you.
Dr. Ostrower, everybody spoke highly of him, and he used to be on the Newsmaker show years ago with Kevin here. Moving on to the topic that's consuming all the media these days, and with good reason, COVID-19. Anything there you wanted to talk about, Gary?
Well, there are a couple of things I would mention. Some things that I have just recently learned. One thing that I have learned, and this is a little bit unsettling, is that 20 to 40% of all the patients who wind up on ventilators as a result of COVID-19 will suffer kidney failure or one level of kidney failure. And part of the problem is that if they do suffer kidney failure, they are then placed on dialysis machines, and we not only do not have enough dialysis machines to accommodate all of these people, but we don't have enough of the fluids that the dialysis machines need in order to operate effectively. So, there's kind of a spin-off from COVID-19. Most of us are not going to hear about that, and fortunately, most people are not going to be so sick as to be put onto ventilators. But for those who are, it's risky. The other point I would make about the ventilators, from what I understand, is that about 50%, or maybe slightly over 50%, of all those people who are put onto ventilators will not survive. I had a former student here at Alfred University whose husband, only 50 years old, was put onto a ventilator just about a little bit less than 2 weeks ago, and he passed away just within 24 hours of having been put on the ventilator. I just find it kind of ironic. More people are dying in the United States today of COVID-19 related illness than are dying of cancer or are dying of heart disease, which of course have traditionally been, at least for most of the 20th century, the two major killer diseases. And I find it stunning to think that it's in the light of these kinds of numbers that so many people are demanding that we open up the country again. Because if we, quote, open it up, what's going to happen is that we're going to have a second wave of disease, of COVID-19 disease. And what's going to happen on this here is similar to what has already happened, what is happening right now as we speak in Singapore. Singapore was the Asian nation that was most effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19. As recently as just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, they only had 10 cases of COVID-19 in Singapore. Today, because they did reopen much of the country, those numbers are surging. And we find them also returning in China as a result of opening up cities like Wuhan and so forth. This is not a hoax, folks. This is not a common cold. This is not simply the flu. And unless we take it seriously, and that means inconveniencing ourselves, we may see, some of the same. And since I'm on the subject of, that second wave, something that I mentioned here before, but I think is worth repeating. In 1918, we had, what they call the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu, I might add, did not begin in Spain, but Spain was neutral during the First World War, and the press was more or less free in Spain, and they reported their cases, and from that point on, everyone was kind of calling it the Spanish flu, except the Spanish, who called it the French flu. But in any case, the Spanish flu was relatively mild in its first phase. And that first phase occurred during the spring, as now, during the spring of 1918. And then it diminished, okay? A lot of what, we're calling social distancing. People were wearing masks and so forth. And we opened up the country. This is most dramatically evident in the city of Philadelphia, where they had a May parade. I think it was a World War I parade. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered. I think this is around May 1st or May 15th or something like that. And what happened was that it exposed many, many more people, and it led to a second wave, and the second wave was much, much more deadly than the first wave. The second wave hit people who were mainly between the ages of 17 and 35, not the very, very young and not the very, very elderly, but, we know the results of that, namely 675,000 Americans out of a total population at that time of only about 100 million, only one-third the size of the United States today. 675,000 people died in this country, and of course worldwide, the numbers were somewhere between, we estimate, between about 40 million and 50 million people.
Dr. Ostrower, the Drudge Report has this morning that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is in grave danger. After surgery, it says that North Korea is downplaying the concerns. Sister in ascendancy. What do you make of these headlines?
I have no idea whether they're true or not. It's funny that when it comes to foreign leaders who we have not particularly liked, these sorts of reports have surfaced. I'm going back 50, 60, 70 years. Sometimes they're true, as was the case, for instance, when Stalin died in 1953. At other times, they were not true at all. And I don't know where this is coming from. I certainly didn't see it in the respectable press. That's what I call, the Times, the Washington Post, and so forth. So maybe Judge is onto something. Maybe they're not. I'd be a little bit cautious. On the other hand, it's entirely possible. And but as I have no other information about that, and so I just as well not comment further.
Another headline off Drudge this morning, rioting in Paris for the second night. Ethnic minorities are angry because they feel that they're being treated badly in this COVID-19 emergency. And they're firing off fireworks in the streets of Paris, apparently. Scrolling down this website from the UK Daily Mail, seeing lots of pictures of Paris police dealing with the protesters. And social distancing continues, it says on the UK Daily Mail. What do you make of this situation in France?
Well, some of the minorities, I'm talking about some of the Muslim minorities especially, in areas which are characterized by limited opportunity, which are characterized by a good deal of poverty, which are characterized by, good old-fashioned discrimination, I suppose. They've been unhappy for a long time, and there certainly has been rioting for economic reasons and for political reasons over the past 3 or 4 years. I think that, the rise of ISIS gave, rise to some of this. I'm more concerned at this point we haven't had rioting yet, but we certainly have had a lot of protests lately. And we've seen protests in quite a number of states here in western New York, in Buffalo, for instance, where an operation called Gridlock Buffalo tried to just stop all traffic in the middle of the city, the idea being that we want to open up Economically, we want to open up Buffalo. We want to open up Western New York. There are plenty of people, I think, who would sympathize with that. We've seen it in Michigan. We've seen it in Minnesota. We've seen it in California. We've certainly seen it in Virginia. And, for instance, in Michigan, some of the protesters were there with AK-47s, and the President of the United States is tweeting what? Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia. I might add, all states with Democratic governors, not any of the states with Republican governors. So, the president is trying to make this into a kind of political issue, really something of a partisan issue. But I think it's very, very dangerous. I think that, number one, we should understand that this stuff is incendiary. When you say liberate Michigan, but we have simply never in American history. I'm going back, until 1790, 1789, with the single exception of the Civil War period, when you did have actual rebellion, of course. But otherwise, we've never had this kind of thing in American history, and I don't know where it's going to lead. Secondly, I think that we should be aware that what the president is trying to do is to distract people. And to distract them from what? From his own administrative failures. I know, most of the people who are listening to this program, no matter how much they might otherwise admire the president, understand that he dithered, that he downplayed, that he minimized this virus from January 3rd, when he first heard about it, right until mid-March, when we could have been gearing up with additional hospital beds, when we could have been, making masks, testing procedures and testing equipment and so forth, as well as what we call PPE, the personal protective equipment, such as gowns and whatnot for hospital workers. We didn't do it. We simply didn't do it. And then, to make matters worse, the president essentially backed away from his own responsibility. He said very explicitly, I take is the word he used. I take no responsibility at all. Those are his words. We've never experienced this kind of presidential failure, executive failure in this country at a time of real crisis. And I think that what the protests are, from the president's perspective, is a neat way to simply distract people from his own failure and from, I think, some of the irresponsibility of these briefings that he has every single day.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Stay with us.
Hey! My dad is bringing home the best birthday cake ever!
It was my 5th birthday, and my dad was bringing home the cake.
Should have been here a half hour ago.
The cake never made it, and neither did my dad. That was the day a drunk driver killed my dad.
Daddy?
Impaired drivers take lives. Think.
Sponsored by the New York State Governor's Traffic Safety Committee. Aired in cooperation with the New York State Broadcasters Association.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, you say it's going to snow at some point, and it has been snowing as of late. It's a little late for that in the season, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Brian, but unfortunately, the pattern, or fortunately, depending on how you look at things, the pattern has turned much colder than normal and a bit stormier than normal. The problem is we keep digging these deep dips in the jet stream from the Great Lakes through the Northeast, and there's still plenty of cold air up in central Canada, so that gets a chance to work its way in here. And I don't think we've talked about snow the last time in the forecast. I see a couple more opportunities with this cold weather pattern right through the end of the month. A lot of cloudiness out there this morning, Brian. It's cold front moving through. We've got scattered showers. They may finish up as a couple of wet snowflakes. The mildest weather we see is this morning. Temperatures are in the 40s, and then it looks like we'll have tendency to fall back a little bit later this afternoon. Going to fall back quite a bit tonight. It's partly cloudy, breezy, and cold. Lows overnight near 25. We're supposed to be closer to 40 this time of year, Brian. Mixture of clouds and sun, breezy for tomorrow. Highs will only be 45 to 50. Tomorrow night, clouding up. Chance of late night rain or wet snow shower. 25 to 30 tomorrow night for the low. Temperatures will start to creep up after midnight. And then looking ahead to Thursday, scattered showers and cool. Highs 45 to 50. Brian, sunrise this morning was at 6:18. And the good news is the sun sets tonight at 8 p.m.
Back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. A tweet from Donald Trump from around 10 o'clock last night, I believe. It says, in light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens. I'll be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the U.S. Dr. Ostrower, your thoughts?
Well, I find that in a way predictable. And I say that because crises like this, and this is a genuine crisis, just as was the Spanish flu back in 1918, allow executives to abuse authority in ways that they have often done. I mean, we see it in other countries. We see it in Hungary. We see it in we see it in Turkey. I'm not sure what the president's constitutional powers are to, quote, suspend all immigration. I don't think he has that constitutional power. But I would also note that if he had done this way back, let's say at the end of January, that's one thing. But today we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of COVID-19 in the United States. In other words, the cat is out of that bag. And for that reason, I'm not sure that this has any health benefits whatsoever. He has been anti-immigrant from day one, and this gives him and Stephen Miller, one of his advisors, an opportunity to do what he would have wanted to do earlier. The president takes a lot of credit for, and given himself a lot of credit, for halting Chinese immigration, which he did, if I'm not mistaken, on the 30th of January. And I give him some credit for that. What I don't give him credit for is then opening up quietly at least 40,000 people from China after that ban on Chinese immigration, not just Chinese immigration, but any travel from China, after that ban was put into effect. 40,000 people came here, many of them, I'm sure, with COVID, which is one of the reasons why the disease has spread as it has. But I think that, there's good reason to be skeptical about what the president is doing, and for that reason, you got to go behind the scenes. And Brian, I'd say one other thing. We were talking a few minutes ago about those protests, and I said that those protests are a distraction to distract us from what I'm arguing is the failure of the president to act decisively. Those protests are not spontaneous. They're relatively small, 75 men, 125 men with their AK-47s or whatever, many of them without weapons, many of them simply with American flags. But they've been organized by conservative pro-Trump groups, such as the Michigan Conservative Council, which is a fundraising group for the president, the Michigan Freedom Fund, which has very, very close ties to the billionaire Secretary of Education, Betty DeVos. Even in Buffalo, the protests were organized by a fellow named Russ Thompson, who is a conservative Trump activist and a fundraiser. So, rather than simply view this as kind of a spontaneous surge of anger, and there's certainly good reason for people to be economically worried about what's going on right now. But we better understand, again, that there's a second story here, as Paul Harvey on this very, very station used to say. And now let's look at the rest of this. Now let's hear the rest of the story.
Paul Harvey was great. Did you know that Kevin Durant actually called him up once and spoke with him on the phone, Gary?
I did not know that.
Yeah, he said it was I believe during Watergate, and Kevin fed Paul Harvey a story of something that some teacher or student was doing at Hornell High School that was pro-Nixon that Kevin thought was interesting, and he called and he was expecting to get the secretary and got Paul Harvey on the line. This day in history, Dr. Ostrower, and we have a Kevin Doran Newsmaker show on our WLEA.net Kevin Doran page about this. The Tiananmen Square protest began with 100,000 students gathering at Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the Chinese may have actually learned something from the Tiananmen Square protest. You will remember, of course, that the protest had lasted. Brian, you may be just too young to really remember this, but some of your listeners will remember that the protest had lasted for literally weeks. People who were demanding more freedom. They wanted additional political rights, which, of course, ever since 1949, since the Chinese Revolution in 1949, they had not had. China was, for all intents and purposes, a totalitarian country. And so the students protested, and they really did protest, not with AK-47s. They protested by sitting in Tiananmen Square, by halting all traffic there and whatnot. They were warned by the Chinese government to clear out. They did not clear out. These kids have a lot of courage, a lot of backbone. And finally, what the Chinese government did was to send in the army. And, of course, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of students, unarmed students, were killed. And it was a real black eye in many ways. The Chinese did clear the streets. It was a way of them, not suggesting, but warning others not to protest. But I think that the Chinese paid a real serious price in respect of public opinion internationally for what happened over there. What I find of interest is that the Chinese have never, with other kinds of protests, such as you had in Hong Kong just in 2019, when there were literally, over months of protests by the Hong Kong population against Chinese crackdowns. The Chinese didn't send in the army in that way. I think they may have learned their lesson from Tiananmen Square, but it was a sad, sad moment in Chinese history when they, pushed the army, when they moved the army in to, clear out these peaceful protesters.
With that, we have to leave it. As always, Dr. Ostrower, thank you for joining us on a Tuesday morning.
As usual, thanks for having me, Brian.
Reuters is declaring